afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. We are very pleased to have you join us this afternoon for today's session around M&A issues for board directors. I will do very brief introductions and then we will get started. One little note is that we will be recording today's session, so I will send out the link when that is available after the fact. And today's session will be 60 minutes in length. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button on Zoom, and we will do our best to fold them into today's conversation. And again, my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. Terry Hill is a partner in BPM's advisory practice, where he co-leads the firm's private capital markets effort and guides investors through post-deal value creation initiatives in their portfolio. With over 25 years of experience as an owner, operator, and consultant, Terry has parlayed his entrepreneurial background into practice leadership, practice management, and project governance innovation. Sonia Nijar is a partner, mergers and acquisitions, corporate at Skadden Arps. Sonia represents clients in a wide range of U.S. and cross-border corporate transactions and provides strategic counsel to both public and private companies on securities law, corporate governance, activist investor situations, and other general corporate matters. Vineet Seth is head of technology M&A at JP Morgan. Vineet has been with JP Morgan for over 26 years with their M&A and emerging technology practices. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur, and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Again, thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to Terry, Sonia, Vineet, and Dan. And I'll hand it off to you, Dan.
Great. Thanks very much, Nancy. Excited to have a conversation with everybody. M&A topic could fill, three-hour sessions if we wanted it to. So we're going to try to make it kind of narrow and relevant. Let me start off where any three of you can hop in. Hopefully all three of you will, with a kind of open-ended question, though. Heads up, Sonia, I am looking at you maybe on this to start. And that is, people describe the current environment as kind of a risk-on pro-M&A environment. Like it's there's some momentum, there's excitement. I think people conflate, IPO momentum with M&A sometimes, but there's this notion that something's ongoing. But at the same time, there's a lot of moving targets about changes in regulatory kind of expectations. On the one hand, there's a sense of a loosening of regulatory constraints, but on the other hand, change itself makes it kind of complicated and hard. So I wonder if, to kick us off, especially thinking about what directors need to know, could you give us your sense of what the regulatory landscape is like and how that's impacting current M&A, thinking, deals, contemplation of deals?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hear you on that. Regulatory remains sort of a point on M&A, and it's something that we talk to boards about all the time. First and foremost, it's one of the main things these days, along with actual purchase price and consideration. And the reason that people are uncertain about kind of what's happening is traditionally a Republican government was sort of less pro antitrust enforcement. But I think here what we're seeing in Trump 2.0 is there are some changes in tone to merger policy, but antitrust enforcement is certainly remaining active. The Trump 1.0 administration was far from a typical Republican approach to antitrust in the first place. It was pro-business overall, but with a strong populist streak. And I think that populist sentiment endures, meaning regulators are going to keep pressing. One thing I think is different from the Biden administration is that we are seeing remedies back on the table. So agencies are more willing to accept consent decrees or settlements rather than blocking deals outright. But I think overall, we're continuing to see a lot of merger enforcement. The 2023 merger guidelines remain intact, and both the FTC and DOJ have confirmed that is here to stay. And what those guidelines do is give regulators an expanded toolkit, and they can be used to pursue broader policy goals from labor issues to content moderation. It's sort of not just the traditional antitrust theories that are used for deals. And we also have new HSR rules, which took effect in February. So those are requiring companies to submit far more detailed information at the very start of the process, including narrative explanations of strategy, competition, and market data. And so companies are now investing significant resources just to get a filing ready. And the board really needs to understand that regulatory risk is not just a back-end issue anymore. It's really front and center from day one. And as the US continues to be strong in antitrust enforcement, other countries are as well. They're taking notice and continuing to be active in their antitrust enforcement.
That's great. That actually gives me a bit of a segue to maybe ask Vineet to weigh in a bit, but also you, Sonia, maybe to continue as well. And that is geopolitical interplay on all this. So there's obviously geopolitical risks. They can be economic, they can be, they can be pure regulatory, they can be diplomatic, and so we've paid attention to CFIUS issues over time. There's a lot of stuff that comes and goes, but I wonder if you could maybe give some highlights about what you think the most salient geopolitical risks that might or might not be regulatory. I'm kind of lumping them under a regulatory umbrella, but they're broader than that, I think, in some ways. And Vineet, feel free to go first, though I didn't give you a heads up. That was a big call on you for this. So you can turn to Sonia and say, Sonia, you go to.
Great. Yeah, look, I just wanted to add, first of all, thanks for having us on this.
Very well.
What I was going to say is, from the perspective of a board member, especially a board member that is on the receiving side of a proposal that takes over the company. So you're sitting there saying, okay, I'm focused on value, obviously, and then equally importantly, I'm focused on deal certainty. And deal certainty, as I think a lot of the things that Sonia was talking about in a classic form, was, am I going to get antitrust approval? And predominantly, it used to be about US.
Right.
Now, what I would say is, in addition to antitrust, from a deal certainty point of view, you have to also start to think about national interest considerations. So whether it's the US, it's the EU, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, they will all come at it slightly differently. But especially if the business happens to be in what I would call a critical industry, and tech is increasingly a critical industry, then you just have to make that a part of your calculus of deal certainty and how much risk are you taking. And if you get drawn into one of these, and I'll let Sonia weigh in on sort of some timeline implications, but if you get drawn into one of these extended review periods where you're having to keep filing stuff with a jurisdiction, or they keep delaying the timeline on you, it makes your business suffer too, and sometimes it could be over a year. So for a year, you have to live under some very restrictive covenants under a deal contract that don't allow you to operate with a degree of freedom. So you also have to think about that in addition to whether the deal's actually going to happen.
Yeah.
But Sonia, I'm sure you've got perspectives on this, but that's where increasingly we're seeing not just antitrust, it's this national interest concept, it's this data regulation, digital assets review. All these concepts are all coming together where any jurisdiction could come at it and say, wait a second, I want to review this.
And let me, Sonia, I want to cue you up, but let me throw out something for you to consider in commenting. In fact, it was a Scan Arps lawyer who told me this a long time ago when I was kind of being brought up through the ranks of M&A. The mantra was, time is the enemy of every deal. Like whatever takes time can kill the deal. It's just, that's just a truism. But Vineet, you've added a piece to that, which I think was always true, but is even more true now. It's not just an enemy to the deal, it's the enemy to the ongoing operation and value of the underlying enterprise. Like, because we joke in Silicon Valley, as you know, you can run a company, you can grow a company, or you can sell a company. Pick two. Like you can't do all three at the time. It's like, as an executive team on average. So Sonia, with what Vineet queued up, maybe give us some comments on that, because I'm interested in these delays being a calculus that the board has to weigh against operational effectiveness, not just deal closure. Like it impacts the enterprise as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we are seeing longer sign to close timelines. And especially, as Vineet noted, it's not just antitrust, but also CFIUS in the US and foreign direct investment laws globally, there's certain deal industries, if there's sensitive data, semiconductors, critical infrastructure, it's not only the US, but other countries that can certainly hold up the deal in between sign and close. And in some cases not allow the deal to close, but in other cases really, holding it up while they do an extended review. There's incredible amount of enforcement in the EU, in the UK, obviously China, and the US as well. And so when we're thinking about deals in between sign and closing, the target company, thinking of a classic acquisition, the target company is going to have restrictions on how it can operate in between sign and close, things it cannot do unless the buyer agrees to it. And you'll have different standards in the agreement. Sometimes it's, the buyer can't unreasonably withhold their consent. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of, reasonable things that they could say, hey, we understand you maybe want to acquire this company, this small company that you think is critical to your business in between sign and close, but we're not going to allow that because it doesn't sort of jive with the way that we're thinking about the future of our combined company. So there are a ton of restrictions. It's an entire laundry list of things. And it really is hard when we're talking about timelines that are over a year.
Right. Let me ask a follow-up to that. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but this one seems relevant. This is a hard question, I think. So you can say, I don't know, but I bet you do. And that is, if you are a board member, and so you're looking at the 30,000 or 20,000 foot level, let's assume let's assume you're the target, perhaps, in the way that you frame this. Let's assume that's highly relevant. Are there deal terms that should be thought of or negotiated differently in light of this change of time frame and expectations around time frame? And maybe if you have some, throw out some examples. So what should directors be thinking if, gosh, we are subject to all that stuff? This might take longer. Our hands might be tied. I need to be careful and make sure that management has negotiated or the deal team has negotiated X or Y or Z. Can you give us a couple of thoughts on that?
Yes.
Great.
So I think one thing that people, classically think of when they're thinking of the entire regulatory package is, is there going to be a reverse break fee? And part and parcel with that, what are the standards by which each company has to continue to try to get those regulatory approvals? So do you keep using your efforts until a regulator says you have to divest something? Either to the buyer or the seller, or are there standards around that? What they have to divest has to be something, material, or does it have to be to a level of it's going to eviscerate one side's business? What level of materiality is that divestiture? And that really is the flip side of, what is your reverse break fee? So if the buyer, is kind of like, we're done, we're terminating this deal, we're not, we can't get regulatory remedies, there's nothing we can do, and all of that is heavily negotiated. What is that reverse break fee going to be? And so those are a couple of the terms we think of classically. Also, things that we see are interim operating covenants. If there's a period, and let's say it's going to be 18 months, it's okay, we're going to negotiate that for the first 12 months, we're not going to do these things. And then maybe we have reduced restrictions for the 12 to 18 month period. We've seen that.
The good news is it sounds like these are all things that we've done before, but you have to pay more attention. Perhaps there's more granularity. Perhaps there's some calibration that changes across time. Okay, that's all great. Vineet, did you have anything you want to throw in there as well?
I was going to say two things. And again, just focusing on the audience here. If you happen to have a business, especially on the sell side, if you happen to have a business that's a fast-moving, fast-growing sector, fast-growing company, fast-evolving business plans, then I think thinking really hard about what Sonia said around restrictive operating covenants, such as ability to hire new talent. Quite often, a buyer will say, I don't want you to double my stock comp expense by hiring expensive talent, but what if that's part of your business plan? We're seeing a lot of companies spend or commit to spend billions upon billions of dollars of CapEx around AI infrastructure.
Sure.
Well, usually a buyer does not want you leaking money out on CapEx unless they've approved a business plan. Now, if you're going to be stuck in a deal where you're in limbo waiting to close for 18 months in Sonia's example,
that's 2 cycles of AI. We'll be a chat GPT 6.5. Like, you'll be dead.
What business plan, right? What business plan?
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and then the last thing I would say, one other thing, which this is not a very common technique, but I'm starting to see it come back in conversation. And it's basically this concept of a ticking fee. And a ticking fee is basically like, look, we all think this deal is going to clear in 4 or 5 months. What if we get dragged to 15 months?
Right.
How do we get compensated for the next 11 months where you've locked in a price, but you're extending duration on us and therefore capturing value from the seller? So all these things are nuanced points. And again, a lot of these things used to not matter so much because, I rarely see board of directors diving into operating covenants and these minutia things, but I think it's increasingly important.
So I want to conflate, I'll move on in a minute to private equity and some other current market trends. But before I do that, two sets of questions. One is the acqui-hire trend, whether it's ebbing or flowing, it always seems to be there. And then conflating that with the issues of, are there any trip points for pure tech companies? Now, we've already mentioned a few of them, so we don't have to repeat, but is the acqui-hire strategy here, so let's change roles, probably our audience, and we'll do a poll in just a second, is more likely to be the buyer of an acqui-hire, in an acqui-hire story. Are there any trip points that are, different from what they've been in the past, tricky, or is there heightened scrutiny for that type of M&A, or is it just the same old, same old?
So maybe I'll start and thinking of more the legal, regulatory perspective, and then Vineet can give us more of the commercial perspective. But I would say that, as regulators are sort of scrutinizing, full acquisitions of companies, we've seen acqui-hires emerge as really a creative way to secure talent without necessarily triggering the same antitrust red flags, most especially in AI. But that being said, regulators are certainly aware of this dynamic and may ask whether the acqui-hire is a stealth way of sort of consolidating competition. So as a board member, what I would say is boards should really ensure that the rationale for the transaction is well documented, that the minutes, all of the materials around the deal show that this acqui-hire deal is really about hiring that talent and capability, and no trigger words, no eliminating a competitor, no domination, nothing like that. You really
Before they get too big, none of that? Is that, yeah, okay, gotcha.
So you really want to have the same discipline that you're going to have in, a deal that you're acquiring an entire company. You want to make sure you have that discipline around your acqui-hires as well.
Okay, got it. Vineet, what about you?
What I was going to say is, look, I think the technology that is used for the acqui-hire structure has been used for a very long time. Frankly, it was mostly used in companies that were getting liquidated. So it used to be sort of a not so pleasant structure where people had to liquidate a business, and this was an efficient way to take care of people and recover some money, right? Now, that's being turned on its head by some very, very large systems who know that no matter what they do in size, will get contested by somebody. And so back to that point about 15 to 18 months of negotiations with regulators or non-business negotiators, right? To avoid that, they've come up with this structure. Now, the thing to know is the necessary condition a lot of times in this is you have to have a talent team led by usually a founder that you really care for this structure to make sense. And then you also have to make sure that there aren't any tripwires in the capital raising rounds that startup company has done with their investors, who are now increasingly putting in fail-safe mechanisms to make sure they're not left holding an empty bag.
Yeah,
I think those are some of the considerations, but the technology is not new. It's just being repurposed.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. So before we move on to kind of private equity questions, we've already mentioned a couple times, but can you, and Vineet, I might pull on you for this, talk to me about the role and or the perception of AI and M&A deals. And so let me preface it by saying clearly, and I think I might have been a part of this trend once upon a time, and for a hot minute after I left Stanford and was a VC, very early stage company, you insert AI into the title, into the business ops, just a little, and weirdly, you're getting this great pop in valuation, and you attract interest in terms of acqui-hires. Now, if you don't have real talent in that direction, it doesn't pan out. But so I'm not talking about that so much, but rather like what should be, if there are any special considerations around this AI dominance. I mean, first of all, AI is sucking up all the capital, not all of it, but a huge amount of it. It's distorting the hiring patterns, the H&R. So yeah, how do we put the AI trending inside the M&A trend? How do they interact?
So maybe I'll up level it first and start kind of the big trends we're seeing in terms of where we see activity. And one of them we've already covered, which is focus on talent. So sometimes it's just about talent. The second big thing we're seeing is companies that have very strong platforms, but they're not necessarily AI platforms. Thinking about tool sets, applications plus talent that helps them put more moats around protecting what they already have, because they think that could get potentially diluted by the large model companies. And then the third thing we're seeing, frankly, a number of deals we've done fall into this bucket, which is either a company that has a cutting edge AI tool or application, but doesn't necessarily have first party or zero party proprietary data to feed that package or application, increasingly going after those data sets. And those tend to be in very narrow, very verticalized spaces. So for example, it could be litigation case history, and what are the systems that control it? It could be insurance data. It could be property tax data. It could be, you can name a bunch of different things where somebody meticulously over decades has pulled together a wonderful database and either is the single source or a dual or a triple source, but there's not many sources, but happens to be independent and happens to be for sale, and those assets I think can be very valuable. So those are the talent, tools, and data are sort of the three themes we're seeing. And I would say most of the action around tooling tends to be smaller in size because these applications are applications. They're beautiful, but they're just applications. And then the datas are more medium size, and then the acqui-hires, I'm sure everybody's read about, so I'm not going to comment on that.
That makes great sense. No, I really like that. I'm struck by your point where if you're a powerful platform enterprise, but you're not AI, building moats to prevent, kind of your entire operational effectiveness being sucked out and replicated. For anyone who is a sci-fi fan, you'll remember the series Heroes from 2006 to 2010. Tim Kring, the most deadly of heroes, scariest of villains and heroes are those who can absorb other people's talents by like being near them. And that's kind of like AI poses a sort of existential threat in a way sometimes to some of those. So we'll have to come back to that sometime in a different session. Moat building for non-AI companies relative to AI defense. Okay, so let me switch gears here and mention that Terry, who is such a trooper, was suffering from probably food poisoning and joined anyway, but no amount of lighting was going to make him seem less green, less ill, and he is, I think, appropriately bowed out. So we aren't going to be hearing from him. We'll bring him back on a different panel. I appreciate him being brave enough to just show up and then us saying, no, you do not have to suffer through this session. So I'm going to lean on you guys a little bit for some questions that probably he would have answered, but I'll give you a heads up when I do. So here's a question about private equity. We were really kind of talking in the larger context, probably public companies or small public companies, large public companies. What about private equity? What are the current conditions affecting, for example, valuations and deal dynamics. We hear a lot about cost of debt, the death of leverage, but it's coming back suddenly because there's private. So maybe enlighten us a little bit about what's actually happening from a trend viewpoint in private equity. And I know that's an overbroad term, so you can pick your tier if you like it and dive in there. So Vineet, do you mind if I have you go first, and then I'll jump to Sonia?
No, I'd love to. So I'm gonna start again at the top, and then we'll drill down. So as of sort of our latest data run mid of the year that we've done, just to give the context as to the size and scale of private equity and how prevalent it has become in the M&A game. There were roughly 12,500 companies that are owned by private equity globally, or sorry, in the US. And that compares to about 4,000 publicly listed companies in the US. All right, so that's all industries, everything. Now, here's another fun stat. When you look at by vintage, by year of vintage for private equity as an industry, the last year of vintage of funds where private equity has been able to return more than 1 times the money that they had raised from investors is 2016. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy point. So the import of that is for the last 9 years of deals, that money has not yet been returned in the form of dividends back or proceeds back to limited partners, right? So my point being, there's a lot of inventory, not just in tech, but across the board in the hands of private equity. And it's also getting a little bit longer in the tooth, which is why you're starting to see, in addition to just private equity selling to other private equity, you're starting to see minority recaps, dividend recaps, moving assets with the help of somebody giving a new mark to an asset into a continuation vehicle or some sort of permanent life vehicle, or in the case of some funds, retail perpetual life vehicles. So you're starting to see all this innovation happen really because, back to my starting point, last 9 years of deal flow has not returned the money that they raised back yet, right? Forget returns on it, right? They have not returned the capital.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, keep going, and then I have a question for you about that, but go ahead.
So that's point number 1. Point number 2, as you can imagine, what that will do is anytime you start to hear, every time Wall Street Journal reports that bankers are getting hired by other bankers because the market's heating up, it's great for me and people like Sonia and me, but what you're hearing is a lot of this inventory is going to start to come out, which means there's a lot of supply. And the question is, who's going to buy it? Is it going to be some of these structured vehicles? Is it going to be funds that have been raised by other people that are not so long in the tooth or heavy on their portfolio assets, or will it be public companies? Right? Those are your options.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question for you and sorry, I'd love you to weigh in on these points as well, but maybe take a stab at this, and then Vineet, you're going to get the advantage of thinking about it for a couple of minutes. So this idea of continuation vehicles and the life cycle extending for even, non-venture type, but just private equity purchase, tune up, resell either to private equity or take public, that cycle is also extending. Tellingly, Thoma Bravo kind of started signaling that. I remember when they were purchasing LawLogix back in 2014, 2015, they were kvetching a bit in a good way, and apologies to Thoma Bravo, I'm going to oversimplify this, but Highland Software was one of their largest portfolio companies in Fund 8, and it was doing great, but it didn't need to go public yet. It was, they wanted to keep it, and so they were selling it to Fund 11. And I remember the comment, like, everybody's mad, so we must be doing it just right? Because Fund 8 is like, it's too cheap. Fund 11 is like, too expensive. And we were getting merged into that company. So I remember hearing about this, and that was pretty early of this now strong 10 years ago, right? Strong trend of continuation funds. What is the next thing that you think is starting to show up that is going to be as or more meaningful than that trend, but people haven't observed it yet? I don't know if you'd see it if you were looking at Thoma Bravo or Silver Lake or some of the big players, but what is it that's next? Because we know about this and it's very impactful, but what else is going to happen next?
Well, I think maybe I'll start, Sonia, and then you can weigh in. Well, I think we recently saw a deal happen around Electronic Arts.
Yes.
And if you read about that, and I have to be cautious in terms of how much I say because we're involved in it.
Ooh, that's our favorite kind. Go ahead. Feel free. Feel free.
All I'm going to say is when you read the public disclosure, what the public disclosure touches on is that a vast majority of the equity check is being written by PIF or the Saudi, sovereign fund.
Yep.
Right. So unlike historical examples where at least a majority, if not half, of the equity check was written by the financial sponsor, general partner, the fund itself, and then syndications happening to limited partners, this seems to be an example of a sovereign fund saying we will fund most of it, but we still would like a local general partner to help us manage it, right? So this is quite a bit of a flipping off sort of the basic model. It also has probably pretty dramatic fee generation implications if most of the equities directly being invested by a limited partner, right? So that could give you some clues, especially for these very large assets, of what might be on the table, especially given a lot of these limited partners who happen to be sovereigns. They don't have to worry about paying taxes.
Yep.
They have a lot of resources today, right? Are thinking about how to reduce friction cost in terms of fee, but also getting asset exposure that they plan to hold for a long time.
Yeah, and we won't even get into the $20 billion of leverage here, but we can come back to that. That's
we won't.
Sonia, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And, we all watched the EA deal closely and all of that yesterday. Having done the Activision deal, it's
Wow.
amazing how this has changed in a few years to being
Yeah.
sold to a consortium versus just being sold to Microsoft. I think to that end, Vinit's absolutely right. I think another thing that we're seeing in private equity is that, the regulators are looking at private equity. They're looking at roll-ups. Those are now a labeled regulatory risk. And so I think part of the diversification as well, you have the consortiums, you have sort of the, sovereign funds coming in. It's sort of not just one fund acquiring all of these things. And I think part of that is revisited through the new regulatory strategy as folks are thinking through this.
That's great. And sorry, Vinit, I didn't mean to call it the JP Morgan 20 billion. I forgot it was JP Morgan until after I said that. But that deserves a whole nother webinar, which we'll have to put together at some point in time. So, well, let me the follow up on that. What do you think is going to be the next step? Do you think leverage is going to come back for the mid-tier? So let's talk for a second. That's kind of mega, but let's talk about mid-tier for a second, where a lot of the transactions are highly relevant to players in Silicon Valley, right? So do you think that tier is going to try to, deploy more leverage moving forward if rates do come down? Do you think that, that isn't going to change, but rather they're going to be kind of continue to be squeezed? They've got a lot of unreturned capital, and yet they don't want to not have a pipeline, right? Like, so they're kind of in between. So you've got these mid-tier funds, which are raising funds, and yet, they're trying to get continuation vehicles. Where's that going to go, if anything? So what I'm asking as a board member in Silicon Valley, because I need to know if I'm building a company, it's doing just fine, but the reality is probably not an IPO. It's either going to be a strategic acquisition, or, I love it when private equity grabs us, cuts a deal, spins us up again. So where's that
maybe going? Maybe I can start, and Sonia, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of these movies too. So Dan, what I would say is one of the big innovations on the financing side, especially for assets that are IP heavy but not physical asset heavy, like software businesses and now AI businesses, and biotech businesses for that matter, or pharma businesses that are cutting edge, has been on the private capital side, right? So there has been a very large, not banking regulated industry that stood up that provides financing for buyouts for these businesses. And so most transactions, whether it's a Thoma Bravo or Vista Equity or Francisco Partners or Advent, go down the list, most of these transactions of recent, especially the bulky middle of software, which is sort of let's say $500 million to $3-4 billion of transaction value. A lot of these transactions are getting highly financed in the private credit market based on ARR multiple loans, right? So they're multiples of ARR, and because these are unregulated, they don't have the type of covenants that a bank loan would have or a syndicated loan like the EA loan would have. They're relatively relaxed. Sometimes they also relax cash pay requirements so they can be PIK. So what I would posit to you is over the last 5 years, a lot of those loans have been made by a lot of firms that in some cases are owned by private equity firms like an Apollo or a Blackstone.
Yeah.
They have that exposure. I don't see that changing because I think that asset class generally has performed well for investors. And given the amount of equity that stands behind them from these private equity firms, I think that's a relatively secured piece of paper, because you essentially have to have the equity wipe out before the asset gets impaired. So I think that's going to continue. Frankly, we have entered into that market through one of our subsidiaries. So we do private credit as well in order to compete with some of these unregulated folks. So I don't expect that to change. Frankly, with rates coming down, it may just get bigger. But Sonia, you may have perspectives too. I'm sure you see a lot of these.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing exactly the same thing. And from our perspective, it's, how do we make sure that, there's the leverage risk is being well managed, and, folks, directors in particular, are making sure to satisfy their fiduciary duties and looking past sort of the, headline multiples and seeing how does leverage fit into this. And so we very much are looking at the legal side of things, but seeing exactly as Vineet was detailing the same trends. Being out here in Silicon Valley and doing tech M&A, we're seeing the same stuff.
Yeah, and trend-wise, it is hard, I think, to arrive at the Goldilocks leverage strategy, right? Like we tend to kind of under and overshoot, and I think it makes a lot of sense to have directors have a lot of discussion and conversation about the knock-on effects of leverage under stress testing. And I know there's some best practices that both of your houses, Skadden in its own way and JP Morgan, have published about understanding the effects of leverage over time in a deal and like. So that's worth reading. I may try to find that and with your approval, send a link to folks who are on the session. But I do want to move to shareholder activism. Before we do that, I think we have a poll. We'll see if people are willing to kind of answer a question. If anyone's been on the receiving end of an activist, meaning a shareholder activist, an asset class that is growing and growing, and by and large has been, beating average returns in most spaces. So see if you've been on the receiving end of that. We'll give it a few seconds and see. See if you're in the middle of it now, you don't have time to join the webinar. So I get that. That's perfectly reasonable. Okay, so about half of the audience, almost exactly. Okay, so half the audience. That's impressive. Has had an activist kind of experience. And so I want to narrow that down and specifically, Sonia, and Nancy, do I need to share the results or did we already do that? We shared them. Okay, there we go. Got it. Okay. And so I specifically, Sonia, tell me a little bit more about where, if at all, or maybe, it's always what it was, activism is showing up in the context of deals. Either someone's contemplating one, someone's about to be a target. Like where is it showing up, if at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, activism right now is at very high levels. Campaigns are continuing to remain elevated. And I would say most campaigns are resolved through settlements rather than through full proxy contest. Where this comes into play in M&A, activists really target kind of both sides of the deal coin. They push companies to do deals like spin-offs or breakups. They'll say, oh, this division is underperforming. We think you should get rid of it. But on the flip side of that, they also campaign against deals that they view as underpriced or too risky. So, the practical point I think for boards is activists are watching every stage of a transaction. And the best defense is really early engagement and a clear, well-documented value rationale for any sort of M&A deal. And I think activism has just become extremely entrenched in our corporate world. I think there were 200 plus campaigns last year, and already there have been over 130 this year. And so we're seeing, activists focusing on strategy and operations rather than purely M&A demands. But when activists do push on M&A, the themes are consistent. Break off the company, spin off non-core assets, or push for a sale. And another thing I would add on shareholder activism is that board representation is a key lever. And so, a lot of these activist campaigns are to get board seats. And, that tells you activists are not just pushing from the outside, they're increasingly getting inside the boardroom. And then those same themes as a board member, somebody has a much larger voice to say, let's divest something, or let's push for a sale.
And I have a question that I always ask, and Benita, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this too. I ask anytime activism comes up, and I wonder if it's different in this context where it's happening around before or after M&A. And that is, people are split on this, and SVDX does a lot of stuff on activism. There is some view that directors need to be more open to activists and recognize that, especially in your point, Sonia, if you end up with a board member, chances are they're among the very best prepared board members ever. They have at their disposal research, which other board members may not even have. They tend to have a fluency around certain operational issues that, good and bad, by the way, but which the average independent board member would not have, because again, they arrived there by design with an operational or some M&A model in mind, and they've got the board book, and then they have their book a lot of times, right? So do you subscribe to, and I'm sure you can give me a nuanced answer if you like, do you subscribe to this whole better to embrace the activist and recognize that there's an asymmetric information advantage? There's a lot going on there, rather than to resist simply on the basis of activists, even if this is true, are a type of distractive interference that ends badly as often as it ends well, right? I mean, if you just look at the empirical, nature of it. So where do you guys fall on that? I'm curious.
I would say, maybe I'll start, Sonia, if it's okay. Yeah, okay. What I would say, Dan, is what we tell every client of ours, and where we have the opportunity to be in front of the board, what we tell them is, be your own activist first.
Oh.
Right? And so what does that mean? What that means is, call on your banker. It could be us. It could be whoever you work with, whoever you trust, to come in once a year and do a mock attack. And say, okay, you guys are out there in the market. We have colleagues that specialize in this. They sit in our M&A team. And so they'll come in with us into the board meeting, and they'll say, look, this is not the JP Morgan view. We're now pretending to be activist X. And we're going to take apart the company's product lines, business lines, and competitive set, and say, where could you get attacked, right? And how will they attack it, and then how to deal with it. And the reason we do that is that's like your free practice run.
Right.
You're gonna get the flavor of how you're gonna get attacked and how to prepare for it. What are the mitigants, right? So the mitigants are, you asking your management team the same questions. Well, if this is so obvious, why aren't you thinking about it? Why aren't you doing it? If the spinoff makes sense, why aren't we exploring it?
Right.
Right. A lot of times it's not that easy, because a lot of these activists, sometimes they want to attack the best companies, the companies that are desired by other companies, because they know there's a takeout.
Right.
For example, a third of the activist demands, usually, again, we've charted this data over time, are about selling the business.
Sure.
So by default, they're going to go after businesses. People have this misconception they'll go after business the weakest or the cheapest. No, it's the best assets that happen to be cheap at the moment in time. Right. And they know there'll be a ready buyer who'll pay a big premium, because that's how they make their 2 and 20, right? So it's sometimes that simple, but the best preparation is, be your own activist. Get outside people to come in and do it for you. They'll do the dirty work. They'll probably do it for free. I know Skadden probably won't, but we will. And we'll help you prepare for it.
The first partner is free. Everyone else costs some extra money. No, just kidding. Yeah. No, Benita, I really like that. I want Sonia to weigh in too. either way, shareholders theoretically win in that story, right? You just described a scenario where there's locked up value, unrealized. Better for a board to unlock that value in cooperation with its current management. There's a lot fewer friction costs, a lot fewer transactions costs, and a lot fewer errors that can destroy value along the way. I mean, the problem with the activist path is it's not unbumpy, right? Like, the thesis could be true, but getting from here to there has lots of potential issues and frankly costs, like lots of costs. So better for a board to do it itself. I really like that. Probably folks listening to this don't follow this, but on both Reddit and to a certain extent on X, previously Twitter, try not to spend much time there, bad for your brain, but on Reddit, there is a meme. So realize the youngest Gen Zs are now 2 years out of business school. Or the oldest Gen Zs are 2 years out of business school. And so now they are commenting on things like M&A deals. And there are these memes that, have management and activists, they're like, nothing to see here. A lot of Star Wars references, right? So recognize that even 25-year-old Gen Zs like see this dynamic where boards themselves should, prompt the hard questions, which, sometimes great management, maybe not, but sometimes management are uncomfortable confronting, but better they do it with a board than an activist. So Sonia, where are you seeing the same thing or is it something different?
Yeah, in fact, maybe JP Morgan and Skadden have coordinated on this because
I suspect that is literally true. Yeah.
Our shareholder activism materials, the top do's and don'ts. Number one is be your own activist.
Yeah.
So we regularly give literally the same advice. You should look at your business like you are an activist. And I think, part and parcel, the second piece of advice is not all activists are evil. So really, understand what, their prior campaigns and themes and approaches have been, and then think about how that applies to your business. And, that's certainly not always the case, but it should be, you should go into all of this with your eyes wide open, and think about your business. And, you as a board, you have all the knowledge. The activist only has, yes, they have their data and their studies, but you as a board have all of the information on the company. And another, piece of advice is keep your focus on your other shareholders. So, ultimately the views of the other shareholders, not of the activist, are going to determine the success or failure of any activist campaign. So, it's easy to focus on, okay, here's the activist. What's the dialogue with the activist? But it's also, what will your other shareholders think about the activists' messages, themes, and opportunities to create shareholder value?
Yeah, no, I think that makes great sense. I mean, so my takeaways would be that one, M&A is inevitably entangled in activism, right? Like it either prompts it, results from it, or both, right? So I think that makes a lot of sense. So if you're thinking about M&A, you should be thinking about activism. And then, if you haven't taken it upon yourself to be your own activist, first you call JP Morgan, who will offer the exercise for free. Then you leverage that with Skadden saying JP will do it for free. Won't you come along too? So I think that's great news. I want to jump to probably our final question, but I want to do a poll first, and this is about value add and the opinion of folks who've gone through deals or observed deals, where they think the value is coming from. I will preface this by saying, let us presume that management and the board provide tremendous value. I'm not counting them in this, so please don't take offense. In fact, they probably provide most of the value, but not counting that, outside professionals. The question is outside professionals. So outside legal counsel, outside investment banker, outside management consultant, separate from that, external auditor, accountant. JP Morgan is complicated. You kind of cross an investment banker, management consultant, you're all the above. But and Skadden too, though legally not, of course. So let's see where we, and again, I didn't mean to make this a contest between Vineet and Sonia. Don't take it personally, the results here, but clearly the lawyers are winning, which is so rare these days, so rare. Take the win, feel warm and happy about that. Okay, so here, my question to you is two parts. One, what do you think is something that boards can do to extract more value on average or consistently from, I think we showed the results. This is why, generally speaking, Nancy should not give me host powers. I should not have any ability to press real buttons here. I'll let her stop that sharing, however that worked. And the question is, how is it that boards can position themselves better to extract even more value from all the professionals that surround these M&A deals and M&A advice? And then the final part would be, what one piece of advice would you give directors as a takeaway? So either read this, do this, ask that question, don't do this, whatever it is. Like, it's something really concrete. And if it's something to read, we can send a follow-up link to everybody. But so first, how to extract more value from the professionals. Because by the way, they're really expensive, right? Like, I mean, they're a huge part of the M&A cost, not a bad thing, but they are. So more value is better. And then one piece of constructive takeaway device or advice. Who wants to go first? Sonia or Vinny? Either one.
Well, Sonia was more popular, so she should go first.
All right, Sonia. Sonia is the winner of the popularity contest among a kind of complex set of choices, though. But yeah, Sonia, you go first.
You know, I will say I think we work hand in hand with the investment bankers, and sometimes we're putting on our investment banker hats and they're putting on their lawyer hats, and you know, so it really is that could have been a combined lawyer investment banker question. But I think you know, to extract the most value from your advisors, I mean, you go through a process of picking advisors, and whether it's management or the board who's picked the advisors, the board ultimately needs to sign off on those advisors. And you know, those are your advisors. And so I would say making time for the process, you know, being a participant in the board discussions, talking to your advisors. If you have additional questions, talking to them, you know, to say, hey, you know, I need additional data from you on X, Y, and Z. You know, just making sure that you are there and participating and, you know, being informed and asking good questions. You know, one thing that we often tell directors is when you're talking about an M&A deal, yes, we lawyers are sitting there at the board meeting taking notes because we're going to make the minutes of that meeting. But we are not, for that, transcribing what you're saying. And the minutes are not going to be saying, you know, Director A said this specific line, Director B said this specific line. So you should feel free to speak your mind. You know, that's not going to be documented in the future and going into court or anything like that. We really want you to be asking the questions that you need to ask to make sure that you're really well informed. And then, you know, I think my takeaways for any directors would be, you know, on an M&A deal, front load the hardest issues. So I mentioned this kind of at the beginning, you know, purchase price consideration, yes. And in this day and age, regulatory, especially if you're going towards a deal with any sort of regulatory hair on it, which are becoming more and more deals. So really front load those hard issues, you know, and just, you know, try to think about any problems that are big ticket items that, you know, might happen in a deal. I think, you know, what I've seen, great boards don't just, you know, approve deals. They really solve the problems before they materialize. And, you know, having advisors who can help you figure out what are some of those problems. You know, talk to your advisors, talk to your management team. You really will get a lot of knowledge from that. And then my other takeaway would be, you know, continue to interact with other directors. I mean, organizations like this one, you know, Stanford Directors College, sort of interacting with your fellow directors is a great way to, you know, continue to stay abreast of the trends and think about what other directors at different companies are thinking about, you know, as they're seeing the landscape as well.
Great. And before I cue Vanita up, who's going to get the final word, let me make a quick observation. I've reached an age where I realize I've been on all sides of every possible deal version. And now I really have, I was brought in as a CEO to tune up a company, which turned out to be more of a turnaround. And then it ended up with very, very, very serious securities and other regulation issues. And so now it's a turnaround and a restructure in Chapter 11. Hadn't done that before. But I have an observation about professionals in all of these circumstances, both M&A and, you know, Chapter 11 reorg is its own like odd version of half M&A, half other. It's so strange. It's the one area I knew nothing about, by the way. So there you go. But the competitive landscape for professionals advising companies at this level is unbelievably tough. But I have noticed that while the expertise runs very deep and is quite remarkable, that the bedside manner, the ability of those professionals to offer it up in an easy to consume way for directors varies widely. And that's, you end up with very strong opinions of what people did or didn't like. And I would say, if you tear off the top layer, it's not a competency or expertise issue, generally speaking. It's too competitive for that. Like anyone who doesn't know what they're doing tends to get shoved to the side and doesn't show up anymore. But it is a difference in people's ability to interface with a wide variety of boards, right? And I say this because, to your point, Sonia, digging into that relationship as a director, making it your job to get more out of the professional shouldn't necessarily be required. A great professional is going to be magically charismatic and good at explaining and anticipating your questions, but not everyone is, and it doesn't mean that expertise isn't there. So I highlight that to directors. Feel free to dig in to get more out of the expertise that chances are is there. Now, you, Vineet, and you, Sonia, I bet you're expert at dishing it up to directors so they can consume it well, but not everyone is as good at that. And I bet you're better experts too, but by this much, not that much. Vineet, you get kind of how to do better with professionals, then final to do for the directors on.
Yeah, so look, I would say a couple of things. Number one, when you get into an actual deal and the timeline of the deal is dictating the cadence and activity level and the interaction level, it's going to be hard for an entire board to track it and be fully involved. So think about whether that's of interest and how you want to get updated. Sometimes it may be better off that you set up a acquisition committee, not a special committee, just an acquisition committee that can help your management team interact with your legal advisors, your financial advisors, and your other advisors to make sure they're up to speed. Right? They're not empowered to make decisions on behalf of the board, but they're there as a sounding board, and they're also being able to Sonia's point, communicate with other board members and keep them up to speed. So that's one thing. Number two, I would say in terms of best practices and how to extract value, I mean, nobody negotiates well in a firefight, right? So do a lot of the lifting when you're not in the middle of the deal. Have us or Sonia's team come in and talk about relevant topics. A lot of times I've seen people do, they'll do a 2-day strategy planning session on the back of that. Hey, have our bankers come in and do a presentation on state of the art, state of the markets, state of competitive landscape. What do they think about our plan? What do they think about activism? You could couple it up with other things where it takes an hour. People like us would be glad to do it because it helps us spend more time with the boards and the management team. I'm sure Sonia would say the same. That's a very easy way and a non-pressure way to extract value, stay current in terms of themes and what's relevant.
Dan, I think you're on mute.
Dan, you're mute.
I was almost perfect. I want to stop there and say we're out of time, but those are great takeaways, great observations. And I so appreciate you spending time with us today, and thank the people who actually did spend time on a Tuesday later afternoon. So that's pretty good. Thanks again. And we will, I'm sure, talk again. We have some good follow-up topics that I think we'll try to bring you back for. Have a great evening.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.